those things. I've seen so many engines, I kind of have a repertoire now. I can kind of tell when you're cheating me. So be accurate. Also, make sure your arithmetic is good. And for those of you that don't get it or don't get it yet, we're talking about the colored one with the circles on it, right? And that has to do with the valves when you open and close. Make sure your arithmetic is good. Remembering that there's 360 degrees in a circle and 720 in two circles. So there's that. So for today, we're going to talk about camshafts a little bit, engine timing, and I'm going to talk about crankcases, and that'll be it. You know what that's going to do? That's going to posture you, set you up for splitting your cases tomorrow. You guys will have pieces all over the place tomorrow. So that'll be happening. Landon and Mark will be helping you with that. I'll give you a bunch more measurements to do, and then we were going to do heel coils, but I wanted to keep you in a parallel track with what we're talking about here for the time being. So we're probably in 2 weeks. I'll have you insert helicoils and do some stud removal and replacement using tools to do that with specialized tools. Also have you do some thread repair. Teach you some thread repair technique. The threads get kind of screwed up sometimes. So we'll show you how to do that. This kind of falls into the handy tips category. And then somewhere down the road, as soon as it gets here, we have a fluorescent penetrant kit on its way. When that shows up, you guys will be doing some fluorescent penetrant work on some crankcases. And after that, we'll have a little bar scope project for you too, in addition to all the other little stuff that you've got going on. So you'll be a little bit busy for a while. So we'll fit all that stuff in as it becomes available. What else? Anybody looking for a day job? Syndicate Composites has been pinging on us looking for people.
Yeah, I just got hired.
I think Ben just got picked up. We've got a couple other people, some alums from the school here have gotten picked up. So know that they're out there. They're not amazing money, but it teaches some good techniques. What else? There's something else I was going to tell you too. What the heck it was? Well, if I think about it, I'll let you know. All right. How you guys doing out in the shop? You doing okay? Pretty smooth. How many of you have kind of gotten to the end of your rope on doing the dimensional checks on the parts that you have spread out now? Still got a little ways to go, some of you. Yeah, you got all the valves measured and all that. So we're going to start you soon on grinding valves too. That's coming up with probably 2-3 weeks. So that'll give you some more to do, right? We're not keeping it on, but you got plenty of time to get it done. And Mark's very good at helping with that. So we've got that coming up too. Let me get this up and running here. We could be done just a little bit early tonight. You guys behave yourselves. Can hear y'all telling each other, don't ask any questions. Don't ask any freaking questions. It'll slow me up. Seven. Okay, let's go to engine timing systems. thing. Okay, so we have a couple of things going on inside the engine. You'll see this when you take your engines apart. You probably already can see it. Once you pull the accessory case off the back of the engine, you saw those gears up there in the back of the engine, right? Y'all see those? There's a little gear on the crankshaft, and there's a bigger gear, about twice as many teeth on the camshaft. And then there's a couple of other gears on the back of the engine that mesh those two together. Y'all see those? Y'all remember seeing them? We'll get some stools over there so you can get up there and take a look. Right? Do that before you take the engine apart, because that's going to kind of explain all the rest of this here. All right, so functions of engine timing. All of this is positively tied together. There's no belts to slip. There's nothing that goes into inner adjustment. It is positively timed when the engine goes together. I've heard people say on engines that don't run so well, well, it must have slipped timing. It doesn't happen. It was put together wrong if it's not timed correctly. It doesn't slip timing. So the two functions are valve timing and ignition timing. So the valve timing is going to determine when the valves open and close. All this has been preordained. You don't have to worry about when the valves open and close so much because the engineering people have already taken care of that. But I want you to know through this little exercise that I've given you, I want you to see the relationship of the valves relative to the rotation of the engine. Okay. So when the valve's going to open, when it's going to close, the durations that the valve is open, it's also known as a span. How long is the valve open? How many degrees is it going to be open? All right. And the overlap. So you have overlap. You have an intake and exhaust valve that are both open at the same time, and that's called the overlap period. The ignition timing is going to set when the spark occurs. And that has to be coordinated with when the valves are open and closed. Okay, this is just basic, real basic stuff. We're going to get into a little bit deeper. I see you're still writing, so I'm going to give you a second here. Ed, are you graduating this semester? A and P? Okay. Well, while we're waiting here, let me remind you of something else that Larry reminded me to tell you or to remind you about. And that is that, so you're going to get your A&P certificate from here. You go and test, get your A&P license. And you could land a really nice job. But I want you to think about continuing at some level, at least getting your associate's degree from either from this school or some other school. And beyond that, take a bunch of classes that are transferable, so check those out first. I'll just take the basket weaving stuff because it's easy and it's fun, and you can get a certificate for doing it. I want you to take something that's tangible, something that's useful, and use that as transfer credit to a 4-year school, because the associate's degree has become the new high school diploma. Okay? So you're all going to be out there, you're all going to be working, probably have good jobs, and some of you are going to make really great money because of that. But when two people come along, one's got a 2-year degree and the other one's got no degree, it starts weighting the scales on who they're going to hire. Do you understand that? Everybody got that? I mean, this is important stuff, and I know you've kind of seen enough of school. All you want to do is see Miramar College in the rearview mirror. But I want you to think about that down the road. So we have people that are supported by other people, students here, that are supported by other people. I understand that. It makes it easier to accomplish that. When you're working and you're going to school, it's a tough son of a gun. I applaud you for that. I know how hard it is. But at some point down the road, probably before you have kids, it'd be a good idea to get yourself into San Diego State or some other decent college, or get an online program going with some college where you take one class a month and get it done. I mean, it's really important, right? So I understand that it's a pain in the ass. I went to Stanford for 1 year, and I was dying there. I wanted somebody to stick a fork in me. I hated it. In retrospect, I probably could have made a lot more money. I made pretty good money over the years, but I could have made a lot more money in being in engineering. But I don't like engineering, so go where your heart is. But having that extra education, when you get the scales, two people, the guy with the degree is going to get that job, going to get that plum job. So that's the last time I'll talk about that. But think about it. Think about it. You don't have to do it when you leave here, or even a year or two after you leave here, but think about doing it at some point. Okay, both of these, the valve timing and the ignition, are coordinated. And what they do is they determine the firing order of the engine. And the firing order of the engine is a sequence of what happens in the cylinders. Right, so firing order of the engine has, we think of it as just when the spark occurs, but the spark also has an effect on when the valves have to open, and when the exhaust and valve opens and so forth. Okay, now on inline opposed engines, all of this is evenly spaced, but one right after another in the order of operation of the cylinders. When you start talking about radials, that kind of goes out the window a little bit. It has to, because you remember the connecting rod, the banjo, is the only one that creates a circular orbit. The other ones are kind of elliptical. So there has to be a compensating cam inside the engine to compensate for the differences in the degrees. So in the magneto, for instance, the breaker cam, how many of you have taken ignitions already? A few of you. So is Mr. North, or not me so much, but Mr. North, have they talked about compensating cams in the magnetos on radial engines? Shame. Okay, so they have a cam.
Yeah,
So
Landon taught that class.
Yeah.
did she?
Yeah, last semester,
okay.
that was Landon.
Okay, I'm gonna get on her ass about that.
Well, she did. George did talk about it.
Okay, so well, let me clue you in then. So on the back of the magneto, on the simple little 4-cylinder magnetos everybody works on, right? They have 2 lobes on the cam, right? 2 lobes, 2 high spots on it. On a breaker cam, on a radial engine, that cam, you don't have an option on where to put it. That cam goes on a spline and fits on only one way. And so what happens is each one of those lobes are going to be at different places around that cam. The engine still fires equally, but because of the way the valves open, because the valves are driven off of the connecting rods and the crankshaft, it has to break up that just a little bit. It's just a few degrees difference between each one of those firing events. And so they put what they call a compensated cam on it. So you would think all those lobes would be equally spaced around it, but they're not. And that's because that connecting rod only moves through a concentric orbit. The master rod only moves through a concentric orbit. Now, it's not always that the number 1 cylinder is the master rod. The master rod is the one that's connected to the banjo. Frequently it's 4 or 6 or 8, something like that, down closer to the bottom of the engine. Why they do that, I can't tell you, but know that cylinder number 1 fires at a slightly different place in time as it comes up on top to the center, because the shape of the orbit for that particular rod takes place in a little bit different time. Okay. So you see what so it sounds like a bunch of hooey, but that's the way that it works. Now also the cam for a radial engine. These lobes are not equally spaced on here. I mean, they look like it, but they're a few degrees apart from one another. And that's also part of it. So the valves also, on an elliptical shape movement of the crankshaft, what has to happen is one valve has to open a few degrees earlier, and maybe one valve will open a little bit later than the other. So they compensate for it in the camshaft and also in the magnetos for the change for the change of the timing sequence. Okay, so single bank V engines and radials. Oh, I just said that. The timing events are not evenly spaced.
What do you mean by single bank V?
Single bank, so they make them 2 deep or 3 deep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying. So it would be twin.
Big twins, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So the V engines are going to have.
Any V engine that uses a single throw and crank, or
Yes.
has 2 rods on a single throw.
No, what it is, it's a single rod, but remember it has all those other rods,
Right.
articulating rods around it.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
On the V engine,
For a V engine, yes.
like the
Yeah,
Harleys.
yeah, they're on a single throw, 2
Okay.
rods on a single throw.
Okay.
Okay. Now, you don't have to write these numbers down because I'm not going to hold you to them. Just know that the spacing is going to be different on V engines. Okay, we talked about this one here. Now write this down again. Maybe write this one down again. So the track on the link rods is going to be elliptical, and the master rod is going to track a circular orbit. It's going to follow right along with the crankshaft, but because the link rods are spaced away from the crankshaft, usually a couple of inches, what happens is it tracks this elliptical orbit. Okay, so the cam rings and the cam block, this is the breaker cam, in a radial are going to take an account for that. It's going to compensate for the difference in the rotational movement of the crankshaft. So the valve duration. So the valve duration is how long the valves are open, from the point at which they begin to lift to the point at which they close. The valve duration, how long the valves are open. Now, the stroke we're talking about here is the crankshaft lifting the piston and allowing it to go down. So it's going to exceed the stroke. So we call it an intake stroke and we call it a compression stroke. But it actually, the valves are open longer than just the 180 degrees of that stroke. And the reason for that is if we have air and fuel running into the cylinder, it will run in easier if it has a back door open, which is to say the exhaust valve is open. If the exhaust valve is closed and we try to get air to move in there, it doesn't move in as freely. So if the piston is moving down and the air-fuel mixture is trying to be carried into the cylinder, it will go in there, no two ways about it. But if the exhaust valve is open slightly, it will flow in a lot freer. So it's not pushing against a pressure wall to get in. What we've done is we've lowered the pressure even lower, and that air-fuel mixture will flow in a lot more freely. So the intake valve is going to begin to open on the exhaust stroke. And it's going to finish closing on the compression stroke. You might want to write that down. It'll help you figure out that little chart that I gave you. Exhaust valve is going to begin opening on the exhaust stroke. And it's going to finish closing on the compression stroke. Okay, so the exhaust valve is going to begin opening on the power stroke. As to say, the piston is still going down and the exhaust valve is beginning to open. And it's going to finish closing on the intake stroke. So valves lead and valves lag is just a terminology for what's happening before or after top dead center and on their respective strokes. There's one point where both valves are open, and that's called valve overlap. So the intake and the exhaust valves both are open for a short period of time, and that's known as valve overlap. So these are all questions that that little piece of paper is going to give you. You're going to have to figure out what the overlap is, identify where the overlap is, the lead and the lag for any given stroke. Now a lot of this stuff's pretty cream puff, but you're going to have to sit down for this particular exercise and really drill into it to get it. I want you to get it. I know two of you are going to sit down together and beat it out, and that'll be fine, but be sure that you both understand it. Okay, so it's pretty common on a camshaft for the up ramp. So if the camshaft is operating this direction, counterclockwise, and there's a lifter here, or here, or here, or anywhere, this up ramp can be a lot sharper and straighter. The down ramp may be a little bit more curved to it. What that'll do is that'll hold that valve open just a little bit longer, but it will open very quickly on the up ramp. Do you see how that's possible? Okay. It's going to open the valve quicker, but it's going to allow it to slide closed just a little bit more gently. Now, this is going to happen pretty quick. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
Is this any different with self-adjusting valves?
Self-adjusting valves
Yes.
with hydraulic lifters?
Right.
Sometimes. What happens is, the lifters, with the hydraulic lifters, they're pumped up, and as soon as they hit, the cam here, they're ready to go, they're almost solid. But what they'll do is they'll bleed down a little at a time while it's holding pressure against them. So it'll kind of have the same effect in many respects, yeah. Okay, now you have to remember that the valves open and close, and they land on the seats, and the seats absorb or control the heat on the valves. So anything you could do to allow that valve to sit on the seat any longer is going to be good for the valve. Because if the valve is kept open for any length of time too long, what happens is the valve gets hotter. The valves don't like being hot. The exhaust valves especially, because it has so much heat running past them all the time. So this jumps that valve open, stays on the seat as long as it can, and then it allows it to come back down and land on the seat and dump that heat. Now, on some engines, that'll be the reverse. So they open it slowly, and then they drop the valve closed rapidly. This just allows more velocity in the air to continue to go past the valve and enter the cylinder. So this would be something you might find more in a turbocharged engine, where you're pumping a lot of air into the cylinder. As soon as you open that valve, it's going to start to flow into that cylinder. Also, the valve overlap period will be a little bit shorter on those engines because you're pressurizing those cylinders. Did we talk about camshafts at all? Camshafts at all?
Too much.
I don't know if there's camshafts in here or not. Let me look at something. Maybe it's a good time to do that. Yeah, we should probably do that. Let me crawl out in the weeds here real quick. All right, so let's talk about a camshaft here. Cam rings, we'll get to that in just a second. So on the back of your engine, you look at the back of your engine, there's along the split line in the accessory case part of the engine, there's a big gear and a small gear. So the small gear is going to be attached to the crankshaft, right? Nod. Yes, everybody. Yes, the small gear is attached to the crankshaft. The big gear is the one that's going to be attached to the camshaft. Now, a lot of these have a gear that's integral with the camshaft. So it has a gear that's machined onto the camshaft. Most of your engines, I say not all, but most of them have a gear that is attached or bolted on. Some of them have that integral gear. I don't know which ones it is, but I remember one had an integral gear on. So you don't have to try to pop that one off. These things also, so this runs at half the speed of the crankshaft, right? This is going to run at half the speed of the crankshaft because that crankshaft is going to go around twice for every time this gear goes around once. So the other way to say that is that the crankshaft runs twice the speed of the cam, or the cam runs half the speed of the crankshaft. Two ways to say it. It means both the same thing, right? Now, these things are oiled, generally speaking. Now, they don't do any oiling from the inside of the camshaft out. So aircraft engines, till recently, never oiled the lifters. So the lifter bodies run on these cams here. And I'm gonna pass this around so you can all look at it, okay? So they run on these cams, these eccentrics. And these eccentrics lift the lifter body, bump them up, and push them, deflect them, which then deflects what? What's the next thing in the valve train that this deflects? Anybody?
Push rod.
Push rod. So it moves the push rod, right? The push rod moves what?
Rocker arm.
Rocker arm, deflects the rocker arm, which deflects what? The valve, okay? And what closes the valve?
Spring.
The springs, right? Because this thing goes away, the pressure comes off of this as it goes down, and the springs then close the valve and holds pressure against this. So the springs do a couple things. They close the valve, but also they hold pressure against the camshaft, so you don't have the lifter bodies in there slapping this thing. So you can see there's no oil really on the lobes, but in this case, this camshaft is oiled at the bearings. So this is a bearing journal here, this is a bearing journal here, this is a bearing journal here, and another bearing journal here. Now in automotive engines, they put a bearing in the case to support this thing, because steel or iron cases, right? But we have aluminum cases. You'd think they'd put a bearing in there on an aluminum case, but it's really not necessary because you have so much oil flooding at the bearing that it just sits in there and floats on a film of oil. So having a camshaft wear out a case is almost unheard of. So you just don't need it. When you take it apart, you'll see that there are no bearings in there. You put a cam in a car, you have to kind of wiggle it around through and back and forth and work your way in without tearing up the bearings. But there are inserts that are put into the cases. Not so on aircraft engines. The other thing you'll notice is that there's no oil provided to these lobes. So the lobes, when you start the engine, if the engine sat for a while, would you guess there's much oil on those lobes?
No.
Not much at all. So over a period of time, starting an engine, you've essentially started the engine dry. And it will begin to wear the lobes down. Now, an engine that's operated regularly, that's not a problem. It's not really an issue. So, and as soon as the engine gets started and you have oil pressure in the engine, what's going to happen to this thing? It's going to get lubricated. So inside the engine, when you take your engines apart tomorrow, some of you have oil nozzles in the case, but also remember we talked about crankshafts last week. Right, so you have oil pressure around the journals on the crankshaft, and oil pressure is a result of what?
Restrictions to flow.
Restriction to flow. But you have flow. And what that does, that comes out of the bearings on the crankshaft, and it creates a monsoon of oil around this thing here. Everything on the inside of that crankcase is just full of oil, and it's flying everywhere in there. So these things then get lubricated. But an engine that sits around for any length of time, and especially Lycoming engines, and this is important for you to remember, is that when the oil runs off of these things, they go dry, right? We just talked about that. But the other thing that happens is when you shut the engine down from a hot engine, the engines breathe to the outside atmosphere, right? So if you're in a climate that has any humidity and you shut down a hot engine and it goes cool, and it's also breathing in the air from the outside world, what do you have inside your engine then? Moisture. Moisture and condensation. And so it's easier for it to come in as a vapor than it is for it to go out as a liquid. So you have to run these engines hot enough to boil the water to get it to turn into vapor, to get it to go overboard. So what a lot of people will do is they'll get in their airplane, they'll run it for 15 minutes and then shut it off, park it, not fly it for another couple of months, come back, run it again for another 15 minutes, shut it off. This happens with turbine engines too. Same thing. Engines that sit around, turbines to a lesser degree because they're so damn expensive. So when you have water inside the engine, that's going to cause you to have corrosion. Now, this camshaft here, you can see all these surfaces are just bare steel. And so rust gets after bare steel pretty darn quick, right? So you have, we'll say, in this area here on the highest part of the lobe, you probably have, oh, I don't know, we'll call it 1 square inch of steel in contact with the lifter. And so you've taken and rusted part of that. What happens to the pressure exerted on the remaining part of the steel? Because you know when you rust something, it turns into a pit, right? Of course, it turns into a gray or a red coating, but then it turns into a pit. So what you've done is that pit now has lessened the square area of that lobe. And so what happens to the pressure on that lobe, what's left? Goes up. Right? There's less contact area, but you still have that pesky spring pushing just as hard as it ever was, right? So now you have a higher pressure area, pressure point on that one part of the lobe. And when that happens now, that accelerates the wear on the lobe. Does that make sense? Yeah. So what happens is that, so you can rub these things down. Now this thing here, I'm going to pass it around here in just a minute, is that you end up with a case of where the lobe starts wearing off. And you're going to see that really well in this one center lobe here. Because this is a double lobe to boot. So before you pull your engines apart tomorrow, look at them real carefully. And what you'll see is that on one side, you'll have an exhaust valve pushing on one cylinder, and coming off the other side, going the other way, you're going to have an intake valve on the other side for the cylinder across, or 180 degrees across the engine. So some of these, you see some of these lobes are a little wider, and that's because these lobes are doing double duty. What happens to the pressure on this lobe?
Even higher.
It's even higher, right? It's even higher. So when you have a case where this thing starts up and there's no oil there, this is one of the highest pressure points in the engine because this is a rubbing action here. It also acts like a squeegee, and if there is any oil on there, it tends to push it off or wipe it off ahead of the lifter. Okay, so the lifters they're also prone to wear away, just like this thing here does. So you can wear a hole in the lifter, you can rub the lobe off on the camshaft. There's 2 ways, or both ways. Right? So you have 3/8 of an inch of lift here. If you start losing lift, what happens to the power on the engine? Starts going away, right? But the lifter is going to try, a hydraulic lifter is going to try to hold that height. But after a certain point, it just can't do it anymore. So now you're going to start losing power. So all these little things can happen. Now you see this thing's copper plated between the lobes? Y'all see that? You'll see it when you have it in your hands. Why do you imagine they do that? Why do you imagine they do that?
Corrosion resistance.
What's that?
Corrosion resistance.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's corrosion resistance. So the copper plate between the lobes, usually when you get these back from overhaul or you get a brand new one, they have a black phosphor on the surface. And that acts as a corrosion inhibitor until you start running the engine. But it rubs right off. Down here where nothing rubs against it, they copper plate it, and that just keeps it from rusting inside the engine. Now, Lycoming engines have, let me draw you a quickie picture here. This is important because this stuff happens all the time. This is not an unusual situation. So Lycoming engines, they got a little split in the cases. And they go down this way and across. They're kind of tent shaped. Then they got the sump down below. Then they got the cylinders sticking out here. This will start looking like something here in just a second. And then you got the cylinders, you got the exhaust ports on here, and the intake ports. Well, they're both on the bottom. So you're going to have cooling fins on here too. And you got the rocker covers. You got your crankshaft in here, and your connecting rod. Y'all see where we're at here now? It's kind of orient you. On a Lycoming engine, the camshaft sits up here. Camshaft sits up here on the top. Well, as luck would have it, the breather is also up here on the top. And it's just a hose that connects to the interior of the engine. So when the engine sits around for any length of time, that air is transiting back and forth, back and forth. The oil is dripping off of this, it drips down onto the rod. No big deal for the rod. But when this goes dry, it has all this moisture up in here. The other thing that happens is that you end up with condensation in here. On the aluminum case, not such a big deal. But you end up with water up in here in the top. So that thing lives in a marine environment up in there. On a Continental, the camshaft sits down here. At the bottom, and so what drips off of the rod ends up on the camshaft. So it always seems to have a little bit of oil on it. So that's one of the differences between the Continental and the Lycoming. Here, you pass this around. So look at it carefully. Look at the one fat lobe right in the middle, and you'll see how it started wearing off, rubbing sideways. Something else I was going to tell you too.
Do those get nitrogen?
Yeah, they're nitrided, some of them. Some of them are just plain steel. Oh, when you take your cases apart tomorrow, one person should hold the gear on the camshaft. That way, when you pull the cases apart, the camshaft doesn't go bouncing across the floor like a little wooden soldier as it falls out of the case. Okay, so hang on to that thing, don't let it fall out.
You want
Also-
to pull or lift your bodies out?
What's that?
You want to pull or lift your bodies out?
Yeah, you're
first?
gonna pull them out, but you can't do that. I was gonna say, you can't do that until you pull the cases apart. And so when you pull the cases apart, easy way to do it is grab the cases like this and just march them apart. Okay. Now you're gonna be using a puller to split the cases in most cases out there. So but pull them apart this way and have somebody go on the inside, pull them all out. Mark them as you pull them out, okay, for their position. Otherwise, you're gonna take and go like this, and you're gonna turn it like this, as you would have a tendency to, and you're gonna have stuff all over the floor. So save yourself some aggravation and just work carefully. Half of it can stay on the stand while you pull the other half off. Just a tip to the wise, and Mark will be helping you with that. All right. So kind of got camshafts down a little bit. Okay, so let's see, where were we at? Okay, so sharp ramps, you'll notice this doesn't, these cams don't have sharp ramps on. That's usually turbocharged, supercharged engines. The thing is, when you open the valve too quick or you allow it to close too quick, you end up with pounding inside there. And you'll recall what I said, that the cam lobes are the place in the engine where there's one of the most highest pressure points in the engine. And so anytime you allow any pounding to go on, you just make the problem even worse. So cam wear, most engines, so if they're operated reasonably frequently, they don't exhibit any cam wear. Whatever little cam wear there is can be reground, so the cam can be reprofiled. And all you have to do is reprofile it a few thousandths of an inch. Now you don't send it off to Schneider or Crowler or one of those guys to do it. You have to send it to a shop, a repair station for that, because they know what the specs are. They'll only peel just a few thousandths of an inch off there to regain the profile. If it goes beyond that, the camshaft then becomes scrap. Sell it on eBay to a airboat guy.
And then you take it to Schneider.
What's that?
And then you take it to Schneider.
Well, then you can take it to Schneider, yeah. I don't know, Schneider still in business?
Yep.
Solar power?
And Iski.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the cam timing to the crankshaft is done, as I say, it's hard timed. There's no way for it to slip. You're using gears. I'm going to show you a little picture here on how this is done. Before you take it apart, before you pull your engine apart, I want you to get up in their accessory case and look at the marks on the gears and see how they align with one another. The gears may have a dimple on them, like a center punch mark, or they may have an O that's been inscribed on it or etched into it. There's going to be some way to know what the reference point is on the crank gear. And the cam gears are going to follow suit. Cam gears are going to follow suit. So when you put this thing back together, it's really pretty easy. Only goes together the right way, one way. Now, idler gear, an idler gear is one that may connect the crankshaft to the camshaft gear because there's some distance apart. And it will have one or two dimples or two zeros on them that will mate to the gear. So I'm going to show you a picture here. So there's a series of connections between these gears, yeah.
It's not a question for getting your dimple or having a zero on the teeth.
Let me show you.
No, I got a crankshaft mixed up with the camshaft.
Well, it's all going to be connected together. Let me just move on ahead here real quick,
So I was going to ask if you
You know.
come across like a little bit ahead cam.
and I'll show you. So this is how it's all going to go together. Irrespective of all the rest of the monkey business I've been talking to you about, this is how they fit together. You all see that? Zeros, you could just be dimples too. So you're going to have a high sticking in a low. Just like that. Now these all have to be lined up at the same time. You can't just line up one and then turn the engine and get the other ones lined up because that's not going to be the proper connection between here and here otherwise. You want to get a picture of that? I'll do it. Okay, pretty easy. All right, so should the engine be misassembled? I knew this little biplane one time. Hardly ever happens, but this airplane always ran like crap. And nobody ever really wanted to investigate why it ran like crap until the guy was about to sell it. And he was about to sell this little airplane. The new owner came along and said, "This thing runs like crap," right? So he said, "What's wrong with it?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. It's always run like this." So this guy flew this thing like 500 hours, flew it all over hell and gone, and just figured it was just a crappy engine, even though it had just been overhauled. So one day, when this new buyer came along, he said, "I want that fixed before I buy it." They pulled the accessory case off and found out that those O's were not aligned properly. They were toothed out. Okay. So the engine will run, it's just not going to make good power. And so, they monkeyed around a little bit, lined everything up like it was supposed to. It was like a freaking miracle. The engine just healed itself, right? Well, nothing heals itself. There was a reason for it. So what you end up with is if the timing's too far advanced, you're going to lose power. Okay, it's going to occur sooner. and retarded valve timing, where the valve timing occurs too late, you're gonna end up losing engine power. So there's no excuse for missing this. Sometimes you have to really look to see the marks on the gears. And I'll tell you, the six-cylinder guys, you guys, all you guys on here, boy, everybody look at this. This thing's hotter than hell. Sometimes you have to really look to see the marks on the gears. On that six-cylinder engine, some of the marks are underneath. You're gonna go looking for them, you're not gonna see any marks. Who's working on a six-cylinder? Okay, when you pull the gear off, go like this. Okay, you'll see the marks on the gear teeth on some of those gears. There's some duplex gears there, two or three stacked together, and they're gonna have marks on them to use for timing this thing back together. The easy way to do that is to hit it with a magic marker on the outside where you can see it, and then go ahead and put it back together. So a tip for you. All right. So by missing just one tooth on this thing, you can end up killing the engine insofar as power production goes. It doesn't like it. It's not going to run real well, but one tooth isn't going to really make the engine die. It's just going to run pretty badly. So you have advanced timing, which occurs too soon, and then you have retarded timing, which is going to occur too late. So you can calculate the power delivery. Nobody ever does. If you're like me, you'll love arithmetic so much that you would never do this. It's faster to get the accessory case off instead of calculating the power. So if the engine just runs like crap, there's no other reason for it to run like crap. If the ignition timing is on, if it has good compression, the thing should run good. If it has a power production problem, it doesn't want to accelerate. Let's say the red line on the engine is 2,700 RPM. If it doesn't want to accelerate to that red line, there's something wrong inside the engine. The internal timing of the engine is wrong. Much like a magneto, if the internal timing is wrong on the magneto, how does that magneto work? Good? No, not so good. All right. All right. So if you want to write this down, you're welcome to do that. I had to, when I was taking my ASP test, they actually asked that. They don't ask that anymore. Just know that it's just easier to pull the accessory case off the engine and look inside. And you can do it with it in the airplane in most cases. Okay, so there's quite a number of things that you need to know to do that. I'm not going to monkey around with that. Oh, firing order of the engine. So in the ignitions class, and I'm not sure I've talked about this yet, if you have a four-cylinder magneto, the timing order of the magneto is 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Six-cylinder magneto, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Just that simple. But the engine fires differently because of the way the camshaft's set up, because of the way you want this engine to run without a lot of vibration. So you get one fire on one side, one fire's on the other side. And I'm going to show you something here. I just said that. Write that down or not. It's not in the ignitions class. So if you look at the back of the engine on the magneto, you're going to see the plate that holds all the wires. We'll do a Bendix mag. We'll do a four-cylinder because it's easy to keep track of. And this is number 1. This is number 2. Number 3. Number 4. So the back of the magneto is going to fire 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the way the spark is gonna come out of the magneto, just like that. Now, when I was a young pud, nobody ever really explained this to me, but this has to generate a spark in sequence. So this is gonna generate the spark here first, and then it's gonna generate the spark here, and then here, and then here, and then here. Now, this is not the firing order of the engine, so I didn't know that. So what I did was I hooked 1 to 1, and 2 to 2, and 3 to 3, and 4 to 4, and so forth, and that thing shook. Baby, you could hear that all over the airport, banging and popping. And I felt that. Everybody laughed at me because they knew exactly what I did. So know that this is the magneto firing order here. But the cylinder firing order always starts with number 1. And most of the time, if you look at the engine, it's going to be cast into the engine, or it's going to be somewhere near the data plate. So you can see what the firing order of the engine is. But 1 always goes to cylinder number 1. That's the easy part. Okay. Magneto position 1 always goes to cylinder number 1. They are tied together. Now, Lycoming and Continental still use the same firing order. They just number the engines different, just to make your life miserable. And so that's why I say check the firing order on the engine to make sure that you know where that next wire goes. To know where number 2 magneto wire goes is going to be double important. And I'm going to show you why that is that way. Cylinders are going to fire, if it's a 4-cylinder, you better write this one down. If it's a 4-cylinder, they're going to fire 180 degrees apart. If it's a 6-cylinder engine, it's going to fire 120 degrees apart. And if it's an 8-cylinder engine, they're going to fire 90 degrees apart. Each one of these is going to give you 720 degrees of engine rotation, or 2 turns of the crankshaft to complete all the cylinder cycles. It's all got to be done in 2 revolutions of the crankshaft. Be done here in just a few minutes, and I'll give you a little break.
Can you just 1 second? Just go back to that.
Get yourself a picture. Get your picture.
Okay, thank you.
And the 9-cylinder would be
2 revolutions of the crankshaft. Divide 720 degrees by 9, and you'll have it. Okay.
Pretty simple.
Okay, so you got a Lycoming here, and you got a Continental. You can see that their positions of the cylinders are somewhat different, right? And their location. So this is the front of the engine up here on both of these. But if you think about it, in the firing order, it's going to be 1, 4, 2, 3. So what I want you to do is in your mind, we'll start with this one here because it's close. All right, 1 is going to fire here, and it's going to fire over here. So the 2 position on our magneto is going to be connected to cylinder number 4. Does that make sense? Draw yourself a little picture if you need to. I'll leave this up for a bit to get a picture. Okay, so wire number 2 is going to cylinder number 4 on this Continental. Then the next one that's going to fire is going to be number 2. So wire number 3 is going to go to cylinder number 2. Then the last one to fire is gonna be cylinder number 3. So wire number 4 goes to cylinder number 3. That gets a little confusing, but you just ring this out one at a time and make sure the wire goes the correct direction. Y'all see that? So that's the little continental, right? You go up here on the Lycoming, this one here is always gonna go to 1. 1 is gonna go to 1 here. The next one to fire is gonna be 3. So number 2 goes to 3. Number 3 is gonna go to number 2. And number 4 wire is gonna go to number 4 cylinder. So if you look at the pattern now, what I want you to do is look at the pattern. The patterns are identical to one another. Okay? Patterns are identical. So in this case down here, we're starting with cylinder number 1. Where does that go?
Assume the one.
Cylinder number 1, right? Goes to 1. Second one to fire is going to be number 3. Okay? Where's the pattern going to go? Where's the pattern go? Right. So number 1 is going to fire first, and number 3, this one. The second one here is going to fire, is going to go across this way on this one. The next one's going to go this way. Now if you overlay these patterns, they're going to be identical to one another. Doesn't matter where the cylinders are or what you call them, but the firing pattern is going to be the same. Does that make sense? That make sense? A few of you? A few of you? Let me raise the board here so I can draw on it without having Wheeler yell at me. So let me draw the pattern here. This is 1, 3, 2, 4. And then back to 1. Okay. This one here is 1, 4, 2, 3. And then back to 1. You see the shape of that pattern? It looks the same. They just occur at different times. You all see that? Not so much? Yeah, the pattern is the same, the way they fire. If you overlay one on top of the other, so let me say this, one doesn't always fire first. Why would that be? Why would not one always fire first?
They put it in a different spot.
Yeah, you start it from a different place. So you shut the engine off, it doesn't always clock back to cylinder number 1. So if you shut it off and it starts at cylinder number 3, what's the next one to fire on this one? 1. It's going to go right south. So there you go. You understand that? Maybe? A little bit?
So the magneto retain the last fine order that they did?
Sure. Yeah, if you stop the magneto and the distributor is over here, and the next one fires, in this case it's going to be the 4th one around. The 4th run around, and this one's going to be 3. It's going to start on 3, and the 4th one around on this one is going to be here. So you shut the engine off, it doesn't mean it automatically clocks or reverts to cylinder number 1. Just where it stops is where it stops, and it will start on the next cylinder. Too deep? Too deep? No. Okay, so Lycoming is going to start with the number 1's going to be in the front right. All the odds are going to be on the right side. And of course, Continental has to do it with 1 in the rear. Okay. All the odds are going to be on the right-hand side. Can't do it easy. They can't do it the same way, but the firing pattern is going to be identical. Yeah. Get that drawing out of the way there. Okay, so 6-cylinder engines. gonna be the same pattern on all of these as well. Okay? Same patterns, not the same as a four-cylinder pattern, but it's gonna be the same between Continental and Lycoming both. It's just that the position number of the cylinder is in a different place on the engine. All the odds are gonna be on the right, and all the evens are gonna be on the left. Okay, so if you have a radial engine, you're gonna have 5 cylinders, you're gonna have 9 cylinders, you're gonna have 18 cylinders and so forth. What you're gonna find is that all the odds are gonna fire first, as the firing order is set with the odds first, then the evens. So if you have a 5-cylinder engine, you're looking at 1, 3, 5, and then 2, 4. And then it will pick it back up again on 1, 3, 5, and then 2 and 4 will fire, and then it'll go back to 1. These are easy to remember. Number 1 cylinder is always the cylinder on the top. The one at the highest point is cylinder number 1. So it's easy to know which cylinder is which on radial engines. Now this gets a little murky when you have twin row radials. Oh, and I should also say in the direction of rotation, so you can't pick your own direction of rotation. It's in the direction of rotation of the propeller. So with twin bank rows or 2-row radial engines, the front row is going to be evens and the rear row is going to be the odd cylinder. And they are slightly offset from one another. They don't sit directly behind each other.
What about the Wasp Major?
That's the Wasp Major. 14 cylinders.
Wasp Major 28 cylinders.
Okay, we'll get into that in just a second.
Or times 2.
No, it gets worse than that. Because letters start entering into it. Start entering letters. But I haven't seen one of those in years, so I don't worry about those.
No.
I know where to go look.
Junkyard?
No, actually it was on airplane. Now, you don't have to write this down, but just know that the second row is gonna be all the odds, and the first row is gonna be the evens. Okay. So on a 14-cylinder engine, if you wanna remember this, Mark remembers this kind of stuff. I don't try to remember it. So don't even write it down, all right? Unless you want to. If you add 9 if you can, and everything else subtract 5 to it. If you can't add 9 to the number of the cylinder, subtract 5, and that'll give you the firing order. Okay. Now this and 50 cents will buy you a cup of coffee. Okay, so don't worry about this too much. There's a couple of ways to do it. Right? This is just curiosity stuff here as far as I'm concerned. Good to know stuff, fun to know, but don't worry about it. Okay, last slide, we're gonna take a little break here.
There we go.
So you have 4 banks, and bank A, B, C, D from front to rear. Then you have the cylinders. 7 cylinders, 4 banks, 28 cylinders. So you can have bank A, B, C, or D, front to back. Cylinder number 1, top cylinder, in the direction of rotation. Then it moves to 2, 3, 4, and so forth. So there you go. Go ahead and take a little break now.
So I'm gonna be on the finance.
What's that?